So we were asked to do a kind of survey of a context, and I'm going to be doing a survey of EMI in Hong Kong, mainly since the handover. This is the outline. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the context, because I think this is very important to understand the way in which Hong Kong has a different historical trajectory from the other societies that we've heard about, and the other societies in which EMI has become so important in recent years. So I'm going to be talking about EMI in a post-colonial context, a context in which English has actually been around for, nearly 200 years. So it's a different kind of society. So I want to say a little bit about this, because I think it'll then help to sort of understand how EMI has evolved and, in a sense, the nature of the kind of controversies that we've had. And then basically I'll just talk about the policies and practices in the late colonial period, because of course when you're starting in a new era, your work, you can't sort of start from scratch. You have to take into account what has gone before, and this applies particularly to policies. Basically then I'll be focusing on policies since 1997, but also looking at practices or institutional practices. And I'll be starting by talking about secondary level and then moving on to tertiary level, because EMI is important in both settings. Now, it's very interesting to see Julie's survey at the beginning today, where you have all those countries, and I just wonder whether it's helpful to classify countries a little bit, because I think we're talking about different traditions of EMI. So we've heard today about EMI in Scandinavia, in Spain, in different parts of the world. Here I'm talking about another kind of society, in Cattrew's terms, an outer circle society. Of course, globalization has kind of blown away that model, but I do think it's a convenient shorthand label for a certain type of society that is different from the kind of societies that we heard about earlier. So in these kinds of societies, and of course there's a lot of variation, but this applies to Hong Kong and I think many societies in Africa, South Asia, English still has an important role in the government. At this moment, English is the default medium of written communication in the civil service in Hong Kong, in the public sector, the legal system, the business and professional worlds, as well as in education, where, of course, we're talking about English medium instruction in Scandinavia and other parts of the world, and we're talking about programs, we're talking about modules, we're talking about subjects, rather than universities where the medium of instruction is English. So in many post-colonial societies there are English medium universities. The medium of instruction, assessment, and even the administration is conducted in English. So it's a different kind of trajectory, I would say, and I think this is quite useful to sort of balance out the sort of recent developments in EMI in continental Europe, in Japan, Korea, China, with a post-colonial society where there is a legacy of English. A little bit of background on the kind of linguistic situation. Census data over the last 20 years or so shows very clearly that the major language, most people, 90% of the population speak Cantonese as their first language. That's a very important sort of, in a way, element in what I'm going to be talking about. As you can see, the proportion of people, Hong Kongers, who can speak English as a second language has increased over the years. In 1961 it was about 8%, now it's over 40%. That of course is census and their self-reporting on their proficiency, and that in a way the sort of advancement of English as a second language has essentially been the consequence of English medium secondary education in the 1970s and 80s, and also tertiary education later on. So that gives you a picture of the sort of linguistic situation. But the key thing, and I think this helps to explain how EMI has been so important in Hong Kong, is that for much of the colonial period, English was the only official language. It was only in 1974 that English and Chinese became co-official languages, and in Hong Kong that has typically meant Cantonese and written Chinese. Now, Chinese, I suppose, is the primary official language, and that's not defined. It could mean Cantonese, it could mean Putonghua. So we have to remember the official status of English in society, and the domains in which it still has an important role. In the higher courts, English is still the main language in which court cases are conducted. Even in the lower courts, I would say a lot of the documentation is still in English, because the introduction of colonial rule means the introduction of the institutions of the colonizer, including in the legal system. The public sector is working in English, written English. So the civil service and then the public sector, very important, because this is I think probably the largest employer in Hong Kong, and obviously government employment is often very prestigious. People, sort of want to work for the government, and therefore, if you want to work in the government, you need English. The business and professional worlds, and then in education as a medium of instruction, not the sort of language for certain subjects or programs, but English medium schools, English medium universities, as I'll talk about. Just to give you an example about in a way, the importance of English outside the education system. A few years ago, I did a very large-scale survey of the language situation in the business and professional worlds. One of the questions in that survey was how important are the following languages in your work? So this is white-collar work. I mean, we're not talking about blue-collar work. And as you can see, written English came out at the top. Very, very important. Cantonese, obviously a very important language in the business world, but even spoken English was perceived to be quite important. So when we're thinking about EMI, we're thinking about what happens after students graduate from the education system. In the workplace, in lucrative employment, in prestigious employment, English plays an important role. And then if we're thinking within the education system, at the highest level, the apex of the system, the English is the language of instruction. Now, I'll be showing this chart several times in this presentation, because this gives us a kind of overview of the medium of instruction in the Hong Kong education system. I'm not sure whether at the back you can see all the details, but also historically. And a couple of general points. Doesn't come out very well there, but there are certain lines here indicating the number of years. Recently, there's been a shift to a 4-year degree program, so that's why it's a little a year taken off the secondary system. So a couple of general points. What you see there is English as the medium of instruction, basically across the whole higher education system in Hong Kong, and that, of course, has a big impact on what happens lower down the system. In primary, Chinese has been the medium of instruction. The use of Chinese as the medium of instruction is not controversial. Most parents are quite happy with that. At tertiary level, it's not controversial. There's really no real debate about whether EMI should be, English should be the medium of instruction. The issue there has more to do with, the difficulties of studying in English in practice. The policy issue is not really controversial. So the big problem in Hong Kong, in a way, or the big issue has been what happens at secondary level. And you can see that's where a lot of the changes have occurred, and it's raised questions like, at what point should English medium instruction be introduced in the education system? It has also raised really controversial questions about who should have access to English medium instruction. We will see that after the handover, there was a very controversial policy that restricted access to English medium instruction. I'll start by just talking a little bit about the late colonial period, because I think you can only understand the current situation by looking at what had happened over 155 years of British rule. You can see there that I've sort of the colour coded this as English, so the secondary system was basically where English was the medium of instruction, and in the late 20th century, the late colonial period, you can see this is the proportion of students who are attending the two different kinds of secondary school, English medium, Chinese medium, and you can see in the final year of colonial rule, over 90% of the whole age cohort were in English medium schools. Okay? A very small percentage of students in Chinese medium schools, even though all the research and common sense tells you that if you're talking about what is educationally effective or desirable, it's really obvious. You know, the mother tongue would be, you know, going back to UNESCO in the early 50s. There's nothing unusual about that. And in a way, it goes to a slide that David had, I think a quote from Wilkinson sort of saying, what happens has got nothing to do with what is educationally desirable, what kind of research is conducted, political issues, social issues, demographic issues, economic issues are the cause of this. It's very complicated, I won't go into explaining that, but basically you can think about this in terms of, in colonial Hong Kong, if you wanted to sort of, you know, enter higher education, if you wanted to enter the white-collar workplace, you needed English, and therefore parents would naturally want their kids to go to English medium school, irrespective of their ability to actually, you know, sort of study effectively in English. So that was the situation during the colonial period. Obviously, you can't have a sort of mass education system in which there's a rather remote second language is the medium of instruction. I don't know what would happen in England if French was introduced as the medium of instruction in basically 90% of the schools. Would there be any schools left? Would they be sort of on fire? Would they be in ruins? Would students be sort of set, you know, what would happen? But that's what happened in Hong Kong, okay? And the schools were English medium in the sense that they advertised themselves as English medium schools, and it was reflected in the textbooks, handouts, homework, and of course tests and exams. That's the way in which you can, in a sense, determine whether a school is English medium or not. So the written language would be English, reading and writing in English. But of course, in order to make this content comprehensible, it was essential, desirable for teachers to be able to explain it in Cantonese. So in terms of instruction, in terms of classroom interaction, it was predominantly in Cantonese, with English also being used, mixed mode instruction. Actually, this was a period when there was a time, maybe this chart doesn't really show it, actually there was a shift over this period from education for the elite to education for the masses. And there's a sort of perception that in Hong Kong, you know, in the past there was always this elite English medium system where the teachers really were teaching in English and the students were coping okay. It's actually, I think, a myth, apart from in a very small number of schools. You can go back to the report at the beginning of the 20th century where this Committee on Education was sort of thinking, how on earth could you teach through the medium of English if students can't understand? And actually show that in the top schools, in the English medium schools, actually Chinese was the medium of instruction. So actually what happened in the late colonial period, I think is probably typical of the whole colonial period, apart from maybe certain top girls' schools particularly. Now, government reports and research, in terms of reports and policy documents, you can go back to the mid-1930s and see a general inclination to promote mother tongue teaching and sort of reduce EMI, but basically a lack of desire to actually implement that policy. Basically, the government had a lack of legitimacy, didn't want to upset parents, and therefore kind of, in a way, sort of restricts students' access to EMI. So what the government did was to leave the decisions to the school. We're not going to make a tough decision. You do it. You make that decision, and schools quite reasonably decided to teach officially through the medium of English because they knew that if they switched to Chinese, their student population would go down. And that happened. When a school, encouraged by the government, decided to do that, their sort of the quality of their intake went straight down, and the headmaster was sacked or decided to leave. And so schools basically just continued to use English as the medium of instruction, but in the classroom the language was Cantonese. There was some research during this period, and it basically found that teaching and learning was more effective in the mother tongue, although at this time it's quite difficult to compare English medium instruction and Chinese medium instruction because basically most students were in English medium schools. So after the handover, a big change, although actually this policy was sort of decided before the handover, the government waited until after the handover to implement it. And it's this period from 1998 to around 2009 where you have a stream, an English medium secondary stream, so the schools in Hong Kong were divided by language according to whether they were EMI schools or whether they were Chinese medium instruction schools. And that policy applied only to the first 3 years of secondary school, so years 7 to 9. I put this in a grey area, basically because the senior secondary school, the sort of examination years, it didn't apply, and I'll give you some data on that later on. So this policy was actually called the mother tongue policy, although of course around a quarter of the schools were still officially EMI. So the government identified, and it's quite a common thing, that mixed mode instruction was the source of, you know, unsatisfactory language standards, and basically the use of English medium was very difficult for most students, as you can imagine. So essentially they divided the school system into two. Most schools in this unreformed EMI stream were forced to switch to CMI. About 100 or so, is about a quarter of the schools were allowed to continue using EMI. And as you can imagine, with English being so important in higher education and so important in white-collar work, this was highly controversial, it was divisive, it was discriminatory, and clearly students who were assigned, it's a bit like the old days in the UK where you had grammar schools and secondary modern schools. Those students who were assigned to CMI schools really had their life chances limited. And I mean, in a way, it was a difficult comparison because actually all the EMI schools were Band 1 schools taking the top students, and the CMI schools were Band 2 and 3. So actually the best students went into the EMI stream. So there was evidence about the disadvantages for CMI students. There was a very well-known or sort of widely publicized report by Zhang from Chinese U, basically saying that CMI graduates had less chance of entering higher education. My colleague Bruce Morrison and also Linda Lin did a study comparing EMI students and CMI students, looking at their vocabulary, and found really very clear differences between the active and the passive vocabularies of students entering university. And also Bruce and I did a study where more of a sort of longitudinal study, interview-based study, where we found that students from CMI schools had awful difficulties in their particularly in the first few months. And more recently, I mean, I've done a study, and I'll refer to this a little bit later as well, a study, we've just changed to a 4-year university degree program from the sort of British 3-year program where you specialise initially. In Hong Kong now we've got basically a 4-year program with a first year of general education. And what I was doing, again with my colleague Bruce Morrison, we're looking at how that new generation have adapted to EMI in higher education. One of the things, and it's mainly a kind of interview-based longitudinal study, but there is a survey element, and we did a survey at the end of the first year, so they'd all been in the university for a year. One of the items in the questionnaire asked the students to indicate which type of school they had been in forms 1 to 3, in other words junior secondary, where that policy applied. So did you go to an English medium school or a Chinese medium school? One of the questions we asked was, we asked a couple of general questions. How are you getting on? So there's a question overall, how well have you adapted to studying at university? And then a similar kind of big question, based on your GPA, how well are you doing in your studies? The CMI responses are in blue, the EMI responses. So it's a reasonably balanced study. So it's like about half, just under half and half. As you can, and the higher the mean, the harder, very badly or very well. You can see there are differences, statistically significant, and basically in every single item in this 71 item questionnaire, when comparing the EMI students and CMI students, there were statistically significant differences between them. Maybe the mean itself does not indicate they're doing particularly badly, but we have to remember that's at the end of the first year, not in the first few weeks. And when we did our interviews in the first term, students in CMI schools were really struggling to make that transition from school to university. So there's a further evidence. So it's interesting that there was a review of that mother tongue policy about 10 years ago, and the Education Commission reaffirmed this policy, saying we need to keep, retain this policy, and they said we don't want to see a return to the pre-1998 scenario when many secondary schools claimed to adopt English medium teaching but actually practiced otherwise. They didn't want to see a return to mixed mode teaching, and they also, there's been a lot of money devoted to studies comparing the effectiveness of EMI and CMI. It's quite difficult to conduct those studies because you don't get comparable samples. But those studies generally showed that studying in the mother tongue is more effective. But actually, I think this is a sort of a lesson for that's certainly true in Hong Kong. What is discovered through educational research often has no real bearing on what actually gets done. Or what is educationally desirable has very little bearing on what's done. The government was in a very sort of difficult policy predicament, a very unpopular policy. So basically they had to come up with a way of somehow making life fairer for the CMI students, and they adopted what is called a fine-tuning policy. So this is the most recent period. You've still got the EMI schools, but you've got I've got it on a slide which shows that this fine-tuning, they essentially abolished the labels of CMI and EMI, because students assigned to CMI schools sort of found, that they were discriminated against in many different areas. So they abolished the labels, although actually the sort of, if you like, the tradition of the school was retained. So what this fine-tuning policy does is allow more scope, I suppose, at junior secondary level for English medium teaching within an essentially Chinese medium environment. And then, of course, once you get to the sort of the senior secondary, they can actually switch to English if they want. And I'll show you a bit more detail about that in a minute. Now, I don't know whether, maybe Andy will be able to sort of talk about this later, I don't know whether there's been a lot of detailed research done about what's been happening in classrooms in the fine-tuning policy, but my guess is that what is likely to be happening is the return to mixed mode. Schools will say they've been will try to convince parents, and this is at a time of falling birth rates in which schools are closing down and therefore they need to stay viable. They will necessarily say, yes, we're teaching in English, we're doing more teaching in English, even though there are quite clear rules about how much you can do. That's the policy, but as was mentioned earlier, what about the affected? What about the students? What about the teachers? And it's quite understandable that we'll see a lot more mixed mode instruction. And as again there was mentioned earlier, it tends to be viewed negatively rather than a positive thing. So we don't really have, I think Andy has written a lot about this, the sort of valuable strategies that teachers can use in order to somehow make English medium instruction, workable through using the mother tongue. So there is a grey area at senior secondary. Students can take the English or Chinese versions of public exams. And I think there's evidence of mixed mode instruction in the CMI schools both before and after fine-tuning. So for example, it's quite difficult within the context of a questionnaire to sort of say, what was the medium of instruction of your school in senior level? It was really only in forms 1 to 3 that policy applied. But in the questionnaire, we basically asked those 800 or so participants, so it's the same survey, a different question. What was the language of the textbooks and examinations in your pre-university, so it's like the Hong Kong diploma, the pre-university exam? Because that is a signal of the kind of, in a way, the policy. If they were doing the exams in English or they were using textbooks, that means they were presumably being taught in English. So you can see around 3/4 of the participants said that actually they had mainly done their pre-university exams in English. Around 7% said it was a sort of a mixture of English and Chinese equally, and around 18% mainly in Chinese. So that's the language of the textbook. And it's the textbook and the assignment that is always, in a way, the indicator of what their official medium is. But we also ask them what the language of the classroom is. And again, this is a perception. It's not a real classroom, and it's a very crude question. What would you say? What was typical in your school in terms of what the teachers were doing? And so in terms of teachers' language use, you'll see there's a reduction to 55%, so around just over half of the participants, presumably mostly from EMI schools, said, yep, the teachers were teaching us mainly in English. But as you can see, there's a greater emphasis on English and Cantonese equally, and also mainly Cantonese. There are situations in Chinese medium schools where in one class you have some students who are preparing for the English version of the exam and some preparing for the Chinese version of the exam. What does the teacher do in that situation? What sort of textbooks are used? And you can understand that in most cases they will use Cantonese. Often Cantonese is a much better way of preparing for the exam. The students can ask questions, they can interact more, they can understand things more deeply. The teacher can move through the syllabus very quickly. I mean, we heard earlier about the problems sometimes with EMI in university, the lack of interaction, the slower pace of learning, things like that. That actually Cantonese is a way of speeding things up and actually enhancing learning. Okay, so that's secondary. I've given you a sort of survey of Hitchhiker's Guide to Secondary level. EMI at tertiary level. And again, this in a way dictates a lot of things. What is the language at the apex of the system will have a big impact lower down the system, as we've seen. It has an impact on secondary level. If the medium of instruction in higher education is in English, that is inevitably going to sort of be a problem for Chinese medium studies at secondary level. And going back to 1911 with Hong Kong U and basically all the universities with the exception of the bilingual Chinese university, the medium of instruction is English. And it's got nothing to do with theory, it's got nothing to do with research. I think it's got a lot to do with, particularly in the early days, British political and economic interests. The earliest English medium universities were established in India in the middle of the 19th century. Hong Kong U was one of the earliest colonial universities, but English became established. And the higher education system has expanded considerably in the last 20 or 30 years, and the universities in Hong Kong are very, very highly rated. If you look at those global ratings, I think there are 3 universities in the top 100 for QS, and other universities are doing very well. And probably it's because of that EMI legacy. We talked about the advantages of English if you have an English medium university. The interesting thing is that in my research there's actually been a kind of a shift towards English in the classroom. Now in the late colonial, let's say the 1970s, 1980s, in universities in Hong Kong, so this is before the era of internationalization, student exchanges, obsession with rankings, publication, journals being categorized. This was before this kind of era. If you had a lecture theatre with 100 students, 100 Cantonese students, and you had a Cantonese speaking lecturer, of course the textbooks and materials would all be English, but it's quite likely that the lecturer would use Cantonese to explain the material, or at least use Cantonese to a certain extent. So if you look at the research in the publications in the 1970s, 80s, and even into the 1990s, I think this study was done probably in the late 1990s, there was there were sort of quite a lot of evidence of mixed mode instruction at university level, because most of the teachers speak Cantonese. Virtually all the students at that time spoke Cantonese, not really that different from the school system. And so this article by Lee, Leung and Kemba sort of noted this gap between institutional policy and classroom practice, and they sort of have this quote, whilst most universities and programs of study in Hong Kong have a formal policy of English as the official language of instruction, the whole university is officially English. It's not just individual programs. The data show, and I think it was mainly through interviews, that barely half of the instruction is in English, and there was this gap between, if you like, the theory and the practice. Now, what has happened, I think, in the last 20 years or so, maybe it's even less, is that, like other parts of the world, Hong Kong's universities have become increasingly internationalized. So there have been various trends. Hong Kong is no different from other parts of the world. Students coming on exchange from other parts of the world. Hong Kong realizing, the government realizing that these English medium institutions are actually one of the valuable British legacies that they want to continue. They probably want to get rid of some of the other ones, but this is one of the things that they actually want to preserve, and the fact that they're already English medium is perfect for this policy. Increasing number of Putonghua students and reform of the academic structure, which is, as I said, the shift from, if you like, the old system, which was similar in Britain to the, if you like, the GCSE and A level to and then a specialised degree course. So today you may have a lecture theatre with a physics lecture with 100 students. Maybe 99 of those students speak Cantonese, and maybe the lecturer speaks Cantonese, but there's one person in the back from Denmark. They can't use Cantonese. Of course, they can't, with Putonghua students, they can't they can't necessarily tell whether they're from China or not. But just one student in the back of the room changes everything. And actually, research that I've done, and I'll show you some now, indicates that actually there's been a shift from mixed mode or some use of Cantonese in the university to more of a kind of complete English medium, kind of, if you like, a full immersion. So this study, we were sort of looking at the students' language use. Again, it's perceptions. It's not, we didn't actually go into classrooms. That's something that we should have done. This study that I've been talking about, we wanted to determine students' language use, lecturers' language use in lectures and seminars, and also outside the classroom. And we also did a kind of campus observation to kind of get a sense of what were the languages being used on the campus. So one of the questions was asking the students, and here we're talking about 800 students, so irrespective of whether they were EMI students or CMI students, 800 first-year students, you know, a pretty sizable proportion of that cohort who entered the university at the end of the year. Give us a sort of general picture of what would be the language used by the lecturers in this university. So the scale, 6-point scale, 1 equals always English, at the other end always Cantonese. So basically if they were circling 1 or 2, they were indicating that it was mainly English. So the higher the mean, the greater the use of Cantonese. So you can see in lectures, which are crucial in a way that if you want a barometer of what's going on in the university in terms of the policy, then what the language of the lecture is a good indicator, and it's 1.93. I mean, I think about 50% of the students who filled it in circled 1. Now, I've done research in the same institution going back 10 years or so, and have clearly seen a trend towards increasing English. So what that means is that pretty much that it is the lecturers are delivering in English. In other words, that perception from the late colonial period of mixed mode has disappeared. And I would say there are a number of factors here. Internationalization, the student programs, and the majority of teachers are still Cantonese speakers. We have more Putonghua speakers, so that's a factor. But that would be a very important thing, the student exchanges. Also, in the student feedback questionnaire, there is a question in which students are asked, which language did your teacher use? I mean, something like that. Did they use English always? Did they use English some of the time? So actually, I can imagine lecturers are in a really difficult situation. They know maybe in some cases if the class or tutorial group is all Cantonese speaking, actually it may well be better for them to use Cantonese, but they probably think, student feedback questionnaire, will I get in trouble with the university? I better use English. So you can see a little bit more of an orientation towards Cantonese in tutorials and seminars, which you can understand, a smaller group. Outside the classroom, of course, you can see again more of a mixture. So when students are going to the lecturer's room or going to the lecturer after the class, then quite reasonably they're going to be using more Cantonese. We also asked about the students. How often do you actually speak English in this English medium university? So it's from very often to never. In lectures, I mean, you can see the means are much higher. I guess in a lecture you wouldn't speak so much. I mean, I guess it depends how many people are in the lecture. It depends on the lecturer's style. But in a mass lecture with maybe 100 people or so, I guess you don't find people asking questions very much. So you wouldn't necessarily expect them to ask questions. What is kind of interesting is at the end of the first period of the lecture or at the end of the lecturer will say, and this is data that comes from our semi-structured interviews, okay, do you have any questions, everybody? Nothing, okay. And then as soon as in a way things move off stage, they all rush to the front and ask the teacher in Cantonese, okay. So I wouldn't, this is related to frequency, so I don't think you would expect it to be frequent, but you're certainly, when you're thinking about communicating with other students outside the classroom, what do you do? And you can see, if you look at the mean there, quite reasonably, they will be using Cantonese. Now, we did one other exercise just to see, so we're looking at perceptions of language use among the lecturers and the students' use of English. We also wanted to sort of find out what's going on the campus. Okay, so it's an officially English medium university. The administration, the human resources office, the finance office, student affairs office, all of the communication, the email systems, everything is in English. So really it's a fully English medium institution. So what we did was a kind of experiment just to sort of find out, okay, you've got a group of students here, which language are they using? Or they're wandering around in pairs or small groups, what language do they use when they communicate? So we did this exercise where I didn't do it, it was a couple of research assistants. Basically we wandered around the campus, and as we sort of pass the students. We just made a note. We weren't listening to what they were saying. We were just wandering past, and we could just check. Okay, and then kind of keep a record. And we wanted to kind of keep have an idea of what was the basic language they were using. Were they speaking in Cantonese? And of course, in Hong Kong, in an academic context, their Cantonese would be mixed in with a lot of English. So when I say Cantonese, it's predominantly Cantonese. So we did this 17 times at for around 30 minutes. So it was on the podium, outside lectures, in the break between lectures when people are going in and going out. And altogether we observed over 1,000 interactions. The results of this were not, we didn't actually, we could predict what the results would be, but we just thought it'd be good to have some hard evidence. So 1,000 interactions, some of the people observed would be PhD students or postgraduate students, not all of them would be undergraduate students. And so this is the picture. As you can imagine, over 70% of those interactions were Cantonese. I think it was 16 or 17% of them were in Putonghua, but I think it was about 6% of them were in English. So actually, if you're thinking about this sort of English medium institution, in the lecture theatre, English actually is the language being used. And of course, it's the language of all written communication, textbooks and things like that. But once you move outside that lecture theatre, onto the campus or into discussion rooms, then it's a much more mixed environment. And you'll certainly see a lot more Cantonese. So that's more or less what I wanted to talk about. I'll just sort of kind of give a summary here. Again, just going back to this chart. And the situation now is that we have English pretty much entrenched in higher education, as it always has been. I don't know, maybe 40 or 50 years ago there could have been a discussion about should we change the medium of instruction to Chinese in higher education. I think it's very unlikely that that would happen now in this current era. So I can't see in the future any kind of major change to the medium of the university, to the medium of higher education, unless there is some sort of major upheaval in China. I know that sort of in Chinese universities there has been a sort of an emphasis away from foreign textbooks and things like that. So whatever happens in the future, I think, would have nothing to do with educational research or that type of thing. It would be what's politically happening, socially, culturally. I don't think at the moment there's any pressure to introduce EMI at primary school. Chinese has been the medium. English is taught as a subject, but it basically they're taught in Chinese. Maybe the issue there would be the teaching of Chinese through the medium of Putonghua. But again, we have this issue of what happens at secondary level, and if at the moment the medium of universities and can still, particularly in terms of the written language, the importance of written English, to some extent spoken English in the public sector, in the business world, in the professions. In other words, those points at which you want to advance with English in that situation, and that is basically a legacy of colonialism. It's a different kind of situation in other countries. Then there will be this question of what do we do with EMI at secondary level? When does it get introduced? How do we do it? And then these very politically awkward questions like, if most people can't actually cope with it, should we stop them having it? That's what the government did some years ago. So that's basically the situation. I don't know if you have any questions, please. I'll be happy to answer them.